Imagine a story that begins with a family seeking refuge from famine and ends with a newborn nation marching toward its promised land. This is the extraordinary journey of the Exodus, a story that spans generations. From the arrival of Jacob's children in Egypt as honored guests to their dramatic liberation and the first steps toward their divine destiny in the wilderness. How did a favored people become oppressed slaves? What happened behind the palace walls when a Hebrew baby was raised as an Egyptian prince? Why were 10 devastating plagues necessary to break Pharaoh's resistance? And what became of that inexperienced and unprepared people when they finally crossed the Red Sea, leaving behind the only home they had ever known? Our story reveals not only the cruel oppression and miraculous deliverance, but also the early challenges of life in the desert. The search for water and food, confrontations with enemies, and the learning curve of becoming truly free. From the palace to the wilderness, from slavery to the covenant at Sinai, follow the extraordinary transformation of a group of slaves into a nation with purpose, guided by the visible presence of the God who fulfills his promises through generations. Everything began with a family in search of survival. During a severe famine that plagued the land of Canaan, Jacob and his sons found refuge in Egypt, a land that prospered thanks to the wisdom of Joseph, Jacob's son, who had become the administrator of the Egyptian empire. Through Joseph's favor, his family was granted the best land in Goshen, where they could thrive as shepherds and cattle breeders. Years passed, and the small family of 70 people grew extraordinarily. Joseph died, as did his brothers, but their descendants multiplied astonishingly. God's blessings upon the people of Israel were evident. They were fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, and became exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. However, this prosperity began to stir unrest among the Egyptians. A new pharaoh ascended to the throne, a ruler who did not know Joseph and did not remember the salvation he had brought to Egypt. This new king looked with suspicion at the growing number of Israelites in his territory and feared, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more numerous and stronger than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply." And it happened that, in the event of war, they also join our enemies, fight against us, and so go up out of the land. In just a few generations, the Hebrews went from honored guests to a perceived threat. The transition was brutal, from freedom to slavery, from royal favor to systematic oppression. What was once hospitality turned into hostility, and God's chosen people found themselves enslaved in a foreign land. Then began an era of intense oppression for Jacob's descendants. The Egyptians set taskmasters over them to afflict them with burdens. The Israelites were forced to build Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramesses, using mud bricks mixed with straw under the scorching Egyptian sun. The work was exhausting and cruel. The Egyptian overseers showed no mercy, demanding ever-increasing production under inhumane conditions. Men, women, and children bowed under the weight of heavy loads, molding bricks, carrying stones, and erecting monuments that glorified false gods and an oppressive empire. The more the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites, the more they multiplied. God's blessing seemed proportional to the suffering imposed. This only increased the Egyptians' fear and animosity, who made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. The groans and pleas of the Israelites began to rise to heaven as a continuous cry. Amid the oppression, the people remembered the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and wondered when God would intervene to deliver them. This cry reached the ears of the Lord, who had not forgotten his covenant. Seeing that slavery was not containing the growth of the Hebrew people, Pharaoh took even more drastic measures. He summoned the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and gave them a terrible order. When assisting the births of Israelite women, they were to kill all the male babies, allowing only the girls to live. This order revealed the cruelty of Pharaoh's heart and his determination to control the growth of the Israelites without sacrificing the slave labor they provided. It was a calculated plan to gradually weaken the Israelite community, eliminating its future leaders and warriors while keeping women who could be assimilated into Egyptian society or used as servants. However, Shiphrah and Puah feared God more than they feared the king of Egypt. With courage and wisdom, they silently disobeyed the royal order. When questioned by Pharaoh as to why they allowed the boys to live, they cleverly responded, "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife arrives." God honored the faithfulness of these courageous women, blessing them with families. Meanwhile, Pharaoh, frustrated by the midwives' resistance, intensified his cruel orders. He decreed to all his subjects, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, but every daughter you shall save alive." It was a death sentence over an entire generation, generating terror and anguish among Israelite families. Amid this climate of genocide, in the tribe of Levi, a man named Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his relative. From this union, a son was born, described in scripture as a fine child. His parents saw something special in him, a beauty that seemed to reflect a divine purpose. For 3 months, Jochebed managed to hide her son. With extraordinary maternal courage and ingenious creativity, she concealed the baby from the watchful eyes of Egyptian officials who patrolled in search of hidden children. Every silenced cry, every moment of danger avoided, was a small victory against Pharaoh's decree. But the moment came when she could no longer hide him. The baby was growing, becoming more active and more difficult to keep quiet. Instead of succumbing to despair, Jochebed conceived a bold plan that demonstrated both her faith and her cunning. She took a basket of reeds, a small ark, and coated it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof. She placed the boy inside and set it among the reeds on the banks of the Nile River, the very river where Hebrew boys were supposed to be drowned by Pharaoh's order. Miriam, the baby's sister, stood at a distance to see what would happen to her little brother. The plan revealed deep trust in God. By placing her son in the waters of the Nile, Jochebed was literally delivering him into the hands of divine providence. It was an extraordinary act of faith, a silent declaration that she believed God had a purpose for that child. Divine providence manifested itself in a surprising way. Pharaoh's daughter went down to the river to bathe, accompanied by her maidservants who walked along the shore. Among the reeds, she spotted the small ark and ordered one of her maids to bring it. When she opened the basket, she found the boy crying, a Hebrew baby destined for death by her own father's decree. But instead of fulfilling the royal order, her heart was filled with compassion. "This is one of the Hebrew boys," she said, immediately recognizing the child's origin. At this crucial moment, Miriam, who had been closely watching the scene, approached with an apparently innocent suggestion. "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" The princess agreed, and Miriam ran to fetch the baby's own mother. Thus, through an extraordinary twist of fate, Jochebed was hired to nurse and care for her own son. "Take this child away and nurse him for me," said Pharaoh's daughter, "and I will pay you." The divine plan exceeded all expectations. Not only was the boy saved, but his mother was given the opportunity to raise him during his formative years, under the protection of the very palace that had decreed his death. When the boy grew older, Jochebed brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. It was she who gave him the name Moses, because I drew him out of the water, a name that would echo through the centuries as a symbol of liberation. The early years Moses spent with his biological family were crucial. During this brief period, Jochebed and Amram were able to impart to him the foundations of faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They planted in his heart the seeds of Hebrew identity and the knowledge of the divine promises made to his ancestors. When he was taken to the palace, Moses received the best education Egypt had to offer. As Stephen states in the New Testament, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He learned to read and write hieroglyphs, studied mathematics, astronomy, literature, architecture, military strategy, and administration. The adopted prince had access to the finest tutors and the libraries of the palace. This dual education, Hebrew and Egyptian, uniquely prepared Moses for his future mission. Growing up in Pharaoh's court, he developed leadership skills and gained knowledge of how the most powerful empire of his time functioned. At the same time, he carried in his heart the awareness of his true identity and the knowledge of the God of his fathers. This privileged situation, however, also generated a deep inner conflict. Moses lived between two worlds, the luxury of Egyptian royalty and the awareness of the suffering of his true people. He was a prince of one nation and the son of another that was enslaved by the first. This identity tension would follow him for years until he had to make a definitive choice. The providential preparation of Moses demonstrates how God works through seemingly contradictory circumstances. The boy, saved from the waters, raised both in Hebrew faith and Egyptian wisdom, was being shaped for a far greater purpose than anyone could imagine. Years passed, and Moses grew up, becoming a respected man in the Egyptian court. Despite his privileged position, something in his heart urged him to learn about the plight of his Hebrew brothers. One day, when he had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. During this visit, Moses witnessed something that stirred his indignation. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brothers. This revealing moment confronted Moses with the brutality of the system from which he, as an Egyptian prince, benefited. The contrast between his life of privilege and the suffering of his people became painfully clear. Looking around and seeing no one, Moses made an impulsive decision that would change the course of his life. He killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. This act revealed both his sense of justice and his identification with the Hebrew people. He was no longer a distant observer of oppression, but someone willing to risk his position to defend a compatriot. This violent intervention marked a turning point in Moses' life. It was his first concrete action in defense of his people, a moment when the Egyptian prince publicly assumed his Hebrew identity. However, as often happens with impulsive actions, Moses did not foresee all the consequences of his act. The next day, Moses went out again and saw two Hebrews fighting. Addressing the one who wronged the other, he asked, "Why are you striking your companion?" The response he received was devastating. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" These words revealed two painful truths to Moses. His act of justice had become public, and he was not seen as a liberator by his own people. The rejection must have been especially painful. The man who had risked everything to defend a Hebrew was now being questioned by those he hoped to help. Moses realized that his secret had been discovered. "Surely this matter is known," he thought, and he had good reason to fear the consequences. When Pharaoh heard of the incident, he sought to kill Moses, who was now seen not as a loyal prince, but as a traitor who had chosen the side of the slaves. This experience of rejection was the first of many that Moses would face as a leader. The man whom God had prepared to liberate Israel was already encountering one of the most difficult trials of leadership, not being accepted by those he wished to serve. This lesson in humility would be crucial in shaping his character in the years to come. Faced with the threat of death, Moses fled Egypt to Midian, a desert region. The transition could not have been more dramatic, from the luxury of the palace to the aridity of the desert, from the position of prince to that of a fugitive. The man who had been educated to rule was now merely seeking survival in a foreign land. Weary from his journey, Moses sat by a well in Midian. While he rested, 7 young women, daughters of the priest of Midian, came to draw water to give to their father's flock. However, some shepherds arrived and drove them away, a scene of injustice that echoed what Moses had witnessed in Egypt. Once again, moved by his sense of justice, Moses stood up, defended the young women, and helped them water the flock. When they returned home earlier than usual, their father, Reuel, also called Jethro, asked what had happened. Impressed by the actions of the foreigner, Jethro invited Moses into his home and offered him hospitality. This seemingly simple episode revealed that despite the radical change in circumstances, Moses' character remained the same. Whether as a prince in Egypt or a fugitive in Midian, he continued to stand against injustice and for the oppressed. Moses accepted Jethro's offer to live with him, and he was given Jethro's daughter Zipporah in marriage. From this union, his first son was born, whom he named Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." The name chosen for his son reflected Moses' awareness of his status as an exile, far from his land and his people. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd of his father-in-law's sheep. This occupation, so different from his previous life as a prince, became an essential school of preparation. In the silence of the desert, he learned to know every stone, every path, every water source, knowledge that would be vital when he had to lead an entire people through those same arid lands. The shepherd of sheep was being shaped to become a shepherd of people. The patience needed to guide a flock, the attention to the needs of each animal, the courage to face predators. All of these skills would translate into his future leadership of Israel. If Moses had learned about power and authority in the palace, in the desert, he learned about service and care. This long period in the desert also served to transform the impetuous man who had killed an Egyptian into a mature and humble leader. Scripture would later describe Moses as very meek, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. An extraordinary transformation that could only occur through years of solitude, reflection, and confronting his own limitations. After 40 years in Midian, when Moses was already 80 years old, something extraordinary happened. While tending Jethro's flock, he led the sheep beyond the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, an unusual phenomenon caught his attention. A bush that was burning with fire but was not consumed. Intrigued, Moses said, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." As he approached to investigate, he heard a voice calling him by name. "Moses, Moses!" He answered, "Here I am." Then came the divine command, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." This moment marked Moses' personal encounter with the God of his ancestors, who identified himself by saying, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses, recognizing the holiness of the divine presence, hid his face, afraid to look at God. The symbolism of the burning bush that was not consumed was profound. It represented the people of Israel themselves, who, despite the burning oppression of Egypt, had not been destroyed. It also symbolized the presence of God, who sustains without consuming, who transforms without destroying. And perhaps, more personally, it represented the calling that would burn in Moses' heart for the rest of his life. God then revealed to Moses that he had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt and heard their cry. "I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians," declared the Lord, "and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." And then came the call that would forever change Moses' life. "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." This mission seemed impossible, a shepherd in exile confronting the most powerful monarch in the world and freeing an entire people from slavery. It is no surprise that Moses hesitated and presented a series of objections. His first objection revealed insecurity about his own identity. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? To which God responded with a promise of his presence, I will certainly be with you. The second objection referred to the authority in whose name he would speak. If they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? God then revealed his sacred name. I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. The third objection expressed the fear of not being believed. They will not believe me. In response, God granted Moses 3 miraculous signs: the staff that turned into a serpent, the hand that became leprous and then was healed, and water that would turn into blood. The fourth objection showed concern about his limitations. Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue. God responded by reminding Moses who created the human mouth and promising, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Finally, in a fifth objection, Moses simply asked, O Lord, send whomever you will send, essentially requesting that God send someone else. This evasiveness displeased the Lord, who then appointed Aaron, Moses' brother, to be his spokesperson. Each of Moses' objections was met with divine patience until he finally accepted the mission. His calling illustrates how God often chooses people who feel inadequate and prepares them for extraordinary purposes, transforming their weaknesses into channels for the manifestation of divine power. With his calling accepted, Moses returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and asked for permission to return to Egypt to see if his brothers were still alive. Jethro agreed, saying, Go in peace. God also assured Moses that it was safe to return, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. Moses took his wife Zipporah and his sons, placed them on a donkey, and set out for Egypt, carrying in his hand the staff of God, the common shepherd's tool that would become a symbol of divine power. During the journey, a mysterious episode occurred. On the way, at a lodging place, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. This incident was apparently related to Moses' neglect in circumcising his son, as Zipporah quickly performed the ritual, touching Moses' feet with the cut foreskin and saying, You are a bridegroom of blood to me. After this, the Lord let him go. This enigmatic episode seems to emphasize the importance of total obedience for those who undertake a divine mission. Moses, who would soon demand the obedience of an entire nation to God's commandments, first needed to demonstrate that same obedience in his own household. Meanwhile, God commanded Aaron, Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. Aaron obeyed and met his brother at the mountain of God, where Moses told him everything the Lord had said and the signs he was commanded to perform. Together, they returned to Egypt and gathered all the elders of the children of Israel. Aaron conveyed the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and performed the signs before the people. The result was extraordinary. The people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. The people who had rejected Moses 40 years earlier now received him as God's messenger. The long-awaited moment of liberation finally seemed near. The brothers who had been separated by exile were now united in purpose. The next phase would be a direct confrontation with the oppressive power of Egypt. After gathering the elders of Israel and showing the signs God had given them, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh's palace. With courage, they stood before the powerful monarch and delivered the divine message. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh's response was filled with arrogance and disdain. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. This first encounter set the tone for what would be a prolonged confrontation between the human power of Egypt and the divine power represented by Moses and Aaron. Not only did Pharaoh refuse the request, but he also interpreted it as evidence that the Israelites had too much free time. In retaliation, he ordered that their oppression be intensified. From that day on, the Israelites would have to produce the same quantity of bricks without being given the straw needed to make them. They would have to gather the material themselves while maintaining the same production. The Egyptian overseers enforced this new rule with ruthless rigor. Complete your work, the daily task, as when there was straw, they demanded. When the Israelites could not meet the impossible quotas, the Hebrew officers responsible for production were beaten. Desperate, these officers went directly to Pharaoh to complain, "Why are you treating your servants this way? No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, 'Make bricks.' And indeed your servants are beaten, but the fault is with your own people." Pharaoh responded with mockery, "You are idle, you are idle. That is why you say, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.'" This intensification of suffering created a crisis of faith among the Israelites. The Hebrew officers met Moses and Aaron and accused them, "The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses, also shaken, turned to God in prayer. "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all." God's response to this crisis of faith was to reaffirm his promise and purpose. "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." God reminded Moses of the covenant made with the patriarchs and assured him, "I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rescue you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments." What was about to happen in Egypt was far more than a simple struggle for the liberation of an enslaved people. It was a direct theological confrontation between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. Each plague that God would send would be a specific challenge to an Egyptian deity, demonstrating the Lord's supremacy over all the powers that the Egyptians worshipped. The plagues had multiple purposes. First, the physical liberation of Israel from slavery. Second, the revelation of the power of the true God, both to the Egyptians and to the Israelites. Third, a judgment upon all the gods of Egypt, as God himself declared. And fourth, the manifestation of divine glory that would be remembered for generations. Each plague would follow a pattern. First the proclamation and warning, then the execution of divine judgment, and finally the conclusion, often with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. As the plagues progressed, God would establish a clear geographical division, sparing the region of Goshen where the Israelites lived, demonstrating his specific care for his people. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart, repeatedly mentioned during the plagues, reveals a profound spiritual principle. God respects human freedom, but also uses human resistance to manifest his glory and fulfill his purposes. As Paul would later reflect, "For Scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." The first plague struck at the heart of Egyptian civilization, the Nile River. Considered a deity that brought life and prosperity, the Nile was turned into blood when Aaron, following God's instructions, stretched his staff over the waters. All the fish in the river died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. Pharaoh's magicians managed to replicate this sign with their occult arts, strengthening the king's resistance. For 7 days, Egypt suffered without drinking water, while the Egyptians dug around the river, searching for water to drink. When the first plague ended without producing repentance, the second arrived, the invasion of frogs. Again, through Aaron's staff, frogs came up from the river and covered all of Egypt, entering houses, bedrooms, beds, ovens, and kneading troughs. This plague was a direct challenge to the goddess Heket, the fertility deity with a frog's head. Although the magicians could also produce frogs, they could not remove them. For the first time, Pharaoh showed signs of yielding. "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Moses prayed, and the frogs died, being gathered into heaps that made the land stink. However, seeing this relief, Pharaoh hardened his heart and did not listen to them, as the Lord had said. The third plague came without warning. When Aaron struck the dust of the earth with his staff, the dust turned into gnats, infesting men and animals throughout Egypt. This plague challenged Geb, the Egyptian god of the earth. For the first time, Pharaoh's magicians were unable to replicate the sign, acknowledging, "This is the finger of God." Even so, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The fourth plague marked an intensification of the confrontation and the beginning of a clear distinction between Egyptians and Israelites. God sent swarms of flies, or possibly scarabs, sacred insects, to the Egyptians that invaded Pharaoh's palace, his servants' houses, and all of Egypt. Significantly, in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel lived, there were no flies. Pharaoh began to negotiate, offering a partial concession. "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land." When Moses explained they needed to go into the wilderness to offer sacrifices that the Egyptians would find abominable, Pharaoh momentarily agreed. "I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far." But as soon as the flies were removed by Moses' intercession, Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and would not let the people go. The fifth plague struck directly at the Egyptian economy. A severe plague attacked the livestock in the fields: horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep. This plague challenged Hathor, the cow-headed goddess, and other Egyptian deities associated with livestock. Again, none of the Israelites' animals died, demonstrating God's precise control over the judgment. Pharaoh sent messengers to verify this distinction, but even after confirming that Israel's livestock was unharmed, Pharaoh's heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. Without prior warning, the sixth plague came. Moses and Aaron took ashes from a furnace and scattered them into the air before Pharaoh. The ashes spread as fine dust over all of Egypt, causing boils that broke out into sores on men and animals. This time, even Pharaoh's magicians were affected and could not stand before Moses because of the boils. This judgment possibly challenged Imhotep, the Egyptian god of medicine. Despite this, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen. The seventh plague was preceded by a more severe warning. God declared to Pharaoh through Moses, "This time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth." This plague also offered a choice. Egyptians who feared the Lord's word should bring their servants and livestock in from the fields. When Moses stretched his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder, hail, and lightning that flashed down to the ground. The hail, extremely rare in Egypt, destroyed the flax and barley crops and killed men and animals that were in the fields. Only in Goshen, where the Israelites were, there was no hail. For the first time, Pharaoh admitted his guilt. "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough of thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." However, Moses knew this confession was superficial. "But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God." As predicted, as soon as the hail ceased, Pharaoh continued to sin and hardened his heart, he and his officials. The eighth plague was announced as a testimony for future generations, so that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them. When Pharaoh refused to release the people, an east wind brought locusts that covered the land, devouring every plant and fruit that the hail had left behind. Faced with this devastation, Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron. I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me. After Moses' intercession, a strong west wind carried the locusts into the Red Sea. Even so, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. The ninth plague came without warning. Thick darkness covered the entire land of Egypt for 3 days. No one could see another, nor did anyone rise from their place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. This plague was a direct attack on Ra, the sun god, who was central to the Egyptian pantheon. Pharaoh then offered another partial concession. The people could go, including women and children, but the livestock had to remain. Moses rejected this compromise. Not a hoof shall be left behind, for we must take from them to serve the Lord. Angered, Pharaoh expelled Moses from his presence with a threat. Take care, never see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die. Moses replied, As you have said, I will never see your face again. The Lord announced to Moses that the 10th and final plague would be decisive. One more plague I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. This would be the most terrible of all, the death of every firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's firstborn to the firstborn of the servant, and even the firstborn of the animals. Before the execution of this final judgment, God gave detailed instructions for Israel's protection. Each family was to select a lamb without blemish, a 1-year-old male, and keep it until the 14th day of the month. That night, the lamb would be sacrificed, and its blood applied to the doorposts and the lintel of each house. I will pass through the land of Egypt that night and strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, declared the Lord. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. The families were to roast the whole lamb over fire and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They were to eat it in haste, already dressed for travel, with their loins girded, sandals on their feet, and staff in hand. This would mark the beginning of Passover, Pesach, a perpetual feast to commemorate the deliverance God would accomplish. Additionally, for 7 days following Passover, the Israelites were not to eat leavened bread, thus initiating the feast of unleavened bread. This celebration would be explained to future generations as a memorial of the day when God, with a mighty hand, brought you out of Egypt. Moses gathered all the elders of Israel and conveyed these instructions, adding an important detail. They should use a bunch of hyssop to apply the blood to the doors, and no one should leave their house until morning. The people received these instructions with faith, bowing down and worshipping the Lord. At midnight, divine judgment fell upon Egypt. The Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. The final plague even reached the royal palace, fulfilling God's word that Pharaoh's firstborn, the heir to the throne, would not be spared. That very night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and finally defeated, commanded, "Rise up, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take also your flocks and your herds, as you have said. Be gone and bless me also." It wasn't just Pharaoh who pleaded for the Israelites' departure. The Egyptians urged the people, hastening to send them out of the land, for they said, "We shall all be dead." The terror of death had broken all resistance, and now the oppressors themselves begged for the departure of those they had enslaved for generations. Fulfilling the word God had given to Moses at the start, the Israelites asked the Egyptians for silver, gold, and clothing. The Lord made the people find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they gave them what they asked. This transfer of wealth was both compensation for years of forced labor and a fulfillment of the divine promise that they would leave Egypt with great riches. The exodus of Israel from Egypt was an event of monumental proportions. The children of Israel set out from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. Considering women and children, the crowd likely exceeded 2 million people. In addition to the Israelites themselves, a mixed multitude also went up with them, a diverse crowd that included Egyptians, impressed by God's mighty acts, and other peoples who lived in Egypt as slaves or foreigners. They brought with them flocks, herds, a very large number of livestock. Scripture records precisely the length of time the children of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord left the land of Egypt. This exact date underscores the divine sovereignty over history, showing that even during centuries of apparent silence, God was working according to his perfect timing. Even before leaving Egypt, God established one more ordinance for the people, the consecration of the firstborn. "Sanctify to me every firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast. It is mine." This act symbolized gratitude for the fact that, while the Egyptian firstborn died, those of Israel were spared by the protection of the lamb's blood. God also instructed that, in future years, when they were in the promised land, parents should explain to their children the meaning of this consecration. "With a mighty hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that open the womb, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons." When the people left Egypt, God did not lead them by the shortest route, which would have been through the land of the Philistines, even though that was the direct path. God said, "Lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war, and return to Egypt." This divine decision demonstrated both a deep understanding of the people's fragility and strategic wisdom. Instead, God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. This longer route served several divine purposes: to strengthen the faith of the newly liberated people, to solidify their identity as a nation, and most importantly, to set the stage for an even more impressive display of God's power. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, fulfilling the oath that the children of Israel had made. Centuries earlier, Joseph had said, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you." This action symbolically connected the promise made to the patriarchs with its present fulfillment, uniting the past, present, and future of the nation. The visible presence of God accompanied the people on their journey in an extraordinary way. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. This tangible manifestation of the divine presence served as guidance, protection, and comfort for the people who had spent generations in slavery and now faced the vastness of the wilderness. The pillar of cloud and fire never departed from the people, becoming a constant symbol of God's care. Even when the people doubted or murmured, this visible presence remained as a testament to divine faithfulness. Later, the cloud would rest upon the tabernacle, indicating that God dwelled in the midst of his people. Following divine guidance, the Israelites camped at Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. This location seemed to trap them between the sea and the desert. It was, in fact, part of a divine plan to lure Pharaoh and his army into a final trap. God said to Moses, "Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, 'They are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord.'" As predicted, news of the Israelites' departure reached the royal palace, and there was a shift in the attitude of Pharaoh and his officials. "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" The economic value of the lost slaves began to outweigh the memory of the plagues they had suffered. Without hesitation, Pharaoh made ready his chariot and took his people with him. The pursuing force was formidable. He took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over each of them. The war chariots represented Egypt's military elite, a swift and lethal strike force. The pursuit was relentless, and soon the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea. What seemed like a desperate situation for Israel was, in reality, the perfect setting for the ultimate display of divine power. When the Israelites saw the Egyptian army approaching, panic set in. They were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Fear quickly turned into bitter complaints against Moses. "Were there no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us, to bring us up out of Egypt?" This first major crisis of faith revealed how much they still needed to mature spiritually. "Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, 'Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness." The newly won freedom now seemed less desirable than the safety of slavery. Moses, however, demonstrated remarkable firmness. "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." This statement of faith became one of the great spiritual lessons of the Bible. When there appears to be no human way out, it is time to see God act. The divine response was immediate. God said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward." Although the sea lay ahead, the command was to advance, not retreat. The pillar of cloud, which usually went before the people, moved behind the camp, positioning itself between the Israelites and the Egyptians. All night long, the cloud produced an extraordinary effect. There was darkness to the Egyptians, but it gave light by night to the Israelites. This supernatural separation prevented the armies from approaching each other during the night, providing time for the next divine act to unfold. Following divine instruction, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Then the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. What had been an insurmountable barrier became a path of deliverance through supernatural intervention. The biblical text is clear about the miraculous nature of the event. The waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. It was not merely the natural receding of the waters due to the wind, but a vertical division that formed walls of water on both sides, creating a dry corridor through the sea. The Israelites entered the sea on dry ground, a people of former slaves marching between walls of water, witnessing one of the greatest miracles recorded in Scripture. The crossing of such a large multitude, with their flocks and belongings, must have taken hours, but it occurred safely under divine protection. Seeing the crossing underway, the Egyptians persisted in their pursuit. The Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea. all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. What seemed like an opportunity to capture the fugitives would, in reality, be a fatal trap for the pursuers. In the morning watch, the darkest moment before dawn, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and cloud, looked down on the Egyptian camp and threw it into confusion. This divine intervention caused chaos within the Egyptian army. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. The supernatural reality of the situation finally dawned on the Egyptians, who exclaimed, "Let's flee from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." With the Israelites safe on the other shore, God instructed Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians, their chariots and their horsemen." Moses obeyed, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians, attempting to escape, ran toward the returning waters. The Lord swept them into the sea. The scene was one of total devastation. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The contrast could not have been more stark, but the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The same sea that was an instrument of salvation for Israel became an instrument of judgment for the Egyptians. This event defined Israel's history forever. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. The dominating power that had oppressed them for generations lay defeated before their eyes, not by armies or weapons, but by the direct intervention of the covenant God. The psychological and spiritual impact was immense. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. The deliverance was complete. A slave people had become free through the power of their God. The first response of the freed people was one of praise and worship. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. This victory hymn, known as the Song of the Sea, began with the words, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." This song celebrated not only what God had done, but also who he was. "The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation." There was also prophecy about the impact of this event on neighboring nations. "The nations will hear and tremble. All who live in Canaan will melt away." Miriam, a prophetess and the sister of Moses and Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. In response, she led the women, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." The celebration was communal, involving both men and women in praise for the miracle they had all witnessed. From the Red Sea, Moses led the people into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled without finding water, a first test in their newfound freedom. When they finally reached Marah, they found water, but it was bitter and unfit for consumption. As would become a pattern in the years to come, the people immediately grumbled against Moses. "What are we to drink?" Instead of trusting in the God who had just parted the sea for them, they complained at the first sign of difficulty. Moses cried out to the Lord, who showed him a piece of wood. When Moses threw it into the water became sweet. This first miracle in the desert was accompanied by a spiritual principle. There, the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. God would use the hardships of the desert to test and strengthen the people's faith. He also made a conditional promise. "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians." Continuing the journey, they came to Elim, an oasis with 12 springs and 70 palm trees. This place of refreshment, with exactly 12 springs, one for each tribe, and 70 palm trees, a number representing the nations of the world, seemed especially prepared for them. There they camped by the waters, regaining strength for the challenges ahead. As the journey continued, the entire congregation of the Israelites reached the desert of Sin, which lies between Elim and Sinai. There, a month and a half after leaving Egypt, they faced another crisis: the lack of food. Again, grumbling prevailed. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. God's response was gracious. I will rain down bread from heaven for you. God would meet their needs with two miraculous foods, manna in the morning and quail in the evening. The manna, described as like coriander seed, white, and tasted like wafers made with honey, appeared on the ground each morning like dew. The people were to gather only enough for each day, except on the eve of the Sabbath, when they were to collect a double portion. This daily provision taught lessons of dependence on God and obedience to His instructions. Some tried to save the manna for the next day, contrary to God's command, and it bred worms and stank. Others went out to gather on the Sabbath and found nothing. God was establishing rhythms of work and rest, preparing them for the law they would soon receive. The journey continued to Rephidim, where once again there was no water for the people to drink. The reaction was even more intense. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Moses cried out to the Lord, What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. God instructed Moses to take the staff with which he had struck the Nile and strike a rock at Horeb. When he did so, water gushed out, meeting the people's needs. The place was called Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? In Rephidim, Israel faced its first military conflict when the Amalekites came to attack them. Moses appointed Joshua to select men and go into battle. During the combat, Moses stood on top of a hill with the staff of God in his hand. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, but whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, Aaron and Hur brought a stone for him to sit on and supported his hands, one on each side. Thus, his hands remained steady until sunset, and Joshua defeated Amalek. This first military victory established an important principle. Success in battle depended not only on human effort, but also on intercession and divine power. After this victory, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came to the camp, bringing Zipporah and Moses' two sons. Impressed by all that God had done, Jethro declared, Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. He advised Moses to establish a system of judges to help him in judging the people's matters, so he would not wear himself out trying to handle everything alone. Moses accepted the wise counsel and implemented the suggested structure. Finally, in the third month after leaving Egypt, the people arrived in the desert of Sinai, camping in front of the mountain. This would be their residence for the next 11 months, and there they would receive the law, build the tabernacle, and organize themselves as a nation. The story of the Exodus is only the beginning of Israel's journey. From this moment on, much more would happen in the life of the chosen people. They would receive the 10 Commandments and the entire law at Mount Sinai, build the tabernacle as a place of worship, endure 40 years of wandering in the desert due to their unbelief, and finally, under Joshua's leadership, enter the Promised Land. But in this narrative, we focus specifically on the Exodus itself, from the oppression in Egypt to the arrival at Mount Sinai. This foundational story reveals powerful truths about who God is, a God who hears the cries of the oppressed, who keeps his promises even after centuries, who acts with power to deliver, and who transforms a group of slaves into a nation with a purpose. The Exodus also teaches us about our own spiritual journey. We all need deliverance from some form of bondage, whatever it may be. We all face impossible seas that can only be crossed with divine intervention. And we all, like Israel, learn to trust God through the hardships of the desert in our lives. If this story touched your heart today, I invite you to reflect. From which Egypt do you need to be freed? What sea seems impossible to cross? Remember that the same God who acted powerfully in the Exodus continues to act today. Did you enjoy this content? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more Bible stories explained in detail. Share this video with friends and family who may also be edified by this powerful story of deliverance. See you in the next video.